Exopolitics paper number 3, The Great Galactic Wars. 1. Queendom and Kingdoms in Orion. 900 light-years from Earth, orbiting a star system of a hot blue star in the belt of Orion, a steaming planet was born. This planet was a beautiful jungle-like world. It was allegedly one in a series of planets and star systems which were seeded first, after the goddess had created this universe and it had cooled off enough for life to exist. A team of builders, staff, were appointed, and the show began in this young universe, billions upon billions of years ago. Figure 3-1. The Belt of Orion. After the builders had panspermed the first series of planets, some time passed, and the builders came back and continued the seeding of this particular jungle planet, being the beginning of a rich animal life which eventually would, together with the fauna, develop into a full-grown ecosystem. Then was the time to create a more advanced, intelligent life form, and the first reptilian race in this universe was born. Figure 3-2. Aryan reptilian male, earlier in their development, like comparing us to ape men. They later evolved to look more human-like, depicted here as imagined by this author. This new universe was a universe of free will, an experiment in its own right to see how living entities could survive in a harsher environment and still develop love, compassion and empathy and learn the ways of the goddess. And this jungle world was indeed a harsh environment to survive in. The experiment started with this ancient reptilian race, whom have been called the Ancient Ones in esoteric circles here on Earth, who was the first to prove if they could do it. This particular reptilian species was born with the fire of the mother inserted into their black, reptilian bodies. Although they had a close connection to the goddess, because this was how they were designed, they were still required to go through evolution. Pure survival required of them to develop both brilliance and strong, enduring bodies to be able to master the environment they were born into. In the ancient beginnings, these ruthless, ferocious reptiles had scales covering their bodies for protection, and they could even fly, having huge wings on their backs. With time they learned how to conquer the world they were born into. They started building early civilizations which became more and more advanced, and although civil wars and conflicts were common in the beginning, they eventually managed to explore other planets in their own solar system. As they evolved, their scales disappeared and over the generations they started looking more and more humanoid, but still with certain remaining reptilian features. With time their bodies became long and slender, contrary to the Syrians, who are short and stocky, and their bodies were, and still are black. These days the women have a pinch waist, similar to the bee, and you can see this feature in some human women as well. In Swedish, we call it getting midja or wasp waist. However, when we're speaking of the Aryans, their waistline is very thin, much thinner than in any human female. In the early days, the reptilians had more of a triangular head, but it eventually became more rounded in males, albeit still remaining somewhat triangular in females. They had little, or no body hair, and most of them, even the females, did not have hair on their heads either. Their eyes were large and piercing. According to what I read or hear, these days they are actually, believe it or not, quite gorgeous looking. The saying goes that hardly any male in the universe can resist an Aryan female. 1. The males have broader chests, but just like the females, they have narrow waists. Their legs are thicker and their butt is bigger, showing typical male features. Their faces, although rounded, have a squarer chin than the females, who in general have a softer, more feminine look to them. The mouths of both males and the females are large, and when they are closed, they blend in with the rest of the face and almost seem invisible. Their teeth, however, females and males alike, are still sharp and quite useful after billions of years of evolution. The females, in the early days, also possessed a deadly venom, which she could use in battle by spitting quite a long distance, and whomever got hit, either died or was paralyzed. It seems like she lost her abilities to do this a long time ago. 2. 3. Their society became very female-oriented with time as the species developed, and life in Orion revolved around the Orion Queen. The females did the hard work and the male's role was to mate with the queen and protect her from enemies and invaders. On the battlefield it was usually the males who dominated, although the females were excellent warriors in their own right, but at home it was the female who dominated daily life in the Aryan society. The male was the hunter and the warrior. Early on, the male warriors started conquering neighboring territories and took them over. These territories were then ruled by the males who conquered them, and they became known as the Black Nekh Kings, or just the Black Kings. They ruled their kingdoms with an iron fist. However, in the center of the Aryan world, the queen remained the ruler and was the center of attention. So in that sense, the Aryan world was divided between the kings and the queen. Still, when it came to serious matters, the kings always obeyed the queen's will, so in that sense, the queen was in charge. So it seems like the separation between males and females have been an issue ever since the beginning of time. This subject is also described very well and in details on the Ages of Ur's website. 4. 2. The First Great Galactic War. As time went by, the Aryans became more peaceful and stopped engaging themselves in wars between each other and instead started developing technology under one flag. The kingdoms merged into one kingdom under one king. The weapon industry was an important one, but they also engaged in all other sciences and technologies thinkable and eventually became very high-tech. The male NEKH warriors figured out how to reach out in space and explore the neighbor worlds, but soon also figured out how to do interstellar space travel. They started visiting other star systems which had developed life, just like themselves, but most of these worlds were not nearly as developed as those of Orion. Hence, in the beginning there was no resistance when the Aryans came. The inhabitants of these younger worlds welcomed them with open arms, in very peaceful manners. They simply didn't know better, as they had apparently not developed warlike behavior. The NEKH king and his warriors were surprised to meet this kind of hospitality, but took advantage of it. They started establishing bases on these worlds and soon came to rule them under kings of their own species. But all these conquered worlds answered to the NEKH king who sat on the throne of the Orion Empire on the home planet. The conquest continued, and the Orion Empire expanded without much resistance. However, with time other star races in the galaxy had developed as well, and suddenly the Aryan warriors encountered worlds where the inhabitants could defend themselves. Some of them still stood no chance against the ferocious NEKH warriors, and these worlds, too, were conquered and put under Orion jurisdiction. But not all battles were won. Some of the star beings on planets the Aryans approached were at least as ferocious as themselves, and the reptilians started losing some of these battles and had to retreat. When this had happened a few times, and many Aryans had died in battle, they stopped their conquest for a while to think things over. That was the end of the First Great Galactic War, long before the Sirian star race even existed. 3. The Second Great Galactic War. The Orion NEKH king was pondering what to do. Then he realized that in the distant past, females had been even better warriors than the males, so the king decided to bring the females into the war, to fight side by side with the males. And so they started another galactic war in an effort to expand the empire. Figure 3-3. An artist's vision of an Amazon warrior. This time they were much more successful. The females were not only incredible warriors, who never backed off, always fighting to the bitter end, if necessary, they also had a deadly weapon that the males didn't have, their venom. They could spit the enemies in their eyes, bite them, scratch them with their claw-like nails, or spit on the blades of their swords of knives, and when poking the enemy, if they didn't die from the poke, they died from the poison. The thing is that the venom that was produced could paralyze or kill the enemy in almost an instant. This made the Aryan females feared in the entire sector of the galaxy, among the worlds to which the rumor had spread. This way, a lot of new worlds and star systems were conquered and merged into the Orion Empire, which grew fast and steadily. Albeit, there was also great resistance on some worlds, and not all battles were won, but it looks like most of them were, something that inspired the Aryans to continue their conquest of the galaxy. The female warriors were indeed the legendary Amazon warriors, and legend says that Bellatrix in Orion is the Amazon star. 5. When a world at war with the Aryans had to negotiate, their leaders rather speak to a male diplomat than a female, because they fear their fury. Once a world was conquered, a king was still sat on the throne, but females protected him and the planet. They were seldom heavily armed. All they needed were spears, swords, knives, and perhaps arrow and bow, just like the artist suggests in Fig. 3-3 above. Isn't that how we humans depict an Amazon warrior? We picture them as tall, perhaps giant women, beautiful but deadly, and this was how the early female Bellatrix warriors were. The reptilian Aryan race, contrary to the Syrians, are tall, probably taller than humans, and could perhaps be viewed as giants in our eyes. The conquest continued and the Orion Empire grew in size to become the largest empire in the 9th sector of the galaxy. With hundreds upon hundreds of star systems under the belt, the Aryans eventually settled down and stopped conquering, at least in the capacity that they had in the past. The Second Great Galactic War was over, and this time the success was complete. The Aryans were very pleased. 4. From Kingdom to Queendom. Here on Earth we have a saying that, behind every successful man there is a woman. We joke about it, but in many cases, this is correct. Women in our society have been very suppressed, as we know, and many of them know that they are often smarter than men in many ways. They have more intuition, are more connected with what we call the 96% universe, can see bigger pictures, and make decisions that show to bear fruit over a longer period of time. Hence, because women, when they understand that the man's ego will be hurt if they make the decisions, they often still do, but in a more subtle way. They understand how the man thinks and can be master manipulators so that they get their ways, thinking that it was the man's decision. Thus, his ego is not hurt. I am not suggesting that women are more manipulative than men, but in a suppressed state, they have developed these skills and are using them, often successfully. The same principle worked in Orion. In the Empire, the female was never suppressed like she is here, and was actually the administrator of the Empire even when the kings sat on the thrones of the worlds, but the kings had the real power during, and after, the Great Galactic Wars. At least, that's what they believed. However, just like here on Earth, the kings liked to believe they were the smarter ones, but were manipulated both by the queen and her administrators. They themselves never saw it coming because their egos prevented them from seeing it, but in the eyes of the Aryan people, the queen and her administrators became more and more respected and the ones the people listened to. The queen still sat on the throne as the head of the females, but in the eyes of the kings, she was more decorative and powerful. This was a big mistake, as would show. The Orion queen had planned the coup in the smallest details. One night, the lead king of the Aryan Empire was killed by the queen's female elite warriors. The queen announced to the king's court that there was an ongoing coup, an attempt to take over the empire from within. She blamed the coup on males trying to take over when the king was murdered, but assured the empire that she, the queen of Orion, would help them through these difficult times and would be the new, temporary leader of the empire until the rebels had all been found and assassinated. Then the power would go back to the males, she said, and a new king would be selected. Many protested, especially in the male cabinet, but the queen held her position. However, in the next few weeks, the same males who had protested mysteriously disappeared and were later found dead. So were the heirs of the king. Key people of his bloodline were conveniently assassinated and the empire was in shock and confusion. Still, the queen reassured them that the traitors would be found and taken care of. But this was just the beginning. On the other worlds, which had been conquered by the Aryans, the kings, one by one, were murdered, and the planets were taken over by female administrators. The original inhabitants of these Aryan colonies saw this as an opportunity to rebel, thinking that they had spotted a weakness in the kingdom of Orion now when the kings could no longer defend their domains. Big mistake. The Aryan females were far more ferocious than their male part, and all rebellion was quickly handled in its cradle and order was re-established, more or less immediately. Before the males had had the chance to really come to terms with what was happening, the queen and her warriors had already taken over, not only the home planet in Orion's belt, but also the colonies. The kingdom of Orion had now become the queendom of Orion. The females had regained the power over the empire. 5. The Third Great Galactic War. Once the females had taken back the power in Orion, things started progressing quickly. If star races thought that the Aryan kings were ruthless conquerors, they hadn't seen anything yet. Now things had changed to the opposite, and the royal MEKH, Deaf, and MAKH, Deaf, warriors now served the queen. But the most fearless ones were still the Amazon warriors from Bellatrix. Together, they conquered worlds, not only in their own sector of the galaxy, but in other sectors as well as other galaxies. The triumph was big, because the queen realized that her empire was unbreakable. Who would even think of attacking her now? The rumors of the fury of the queen and her Amazons, MEKH and MAKH warriors spread like wildfire through the universe, and when a star race knew they were approaching, many laid down their weapons and surrendered. The Aryans, when spoken about on other worlds, were often called the SSS, due to their hissing sound when they talked, just like serpents. Although, the queen on the home world was called MEKHD, where T stood for queen, one of her many titles became SSSSSS, both at home and on other worlds. In Orion, if you were a person of rank, you doubled your name, in this case from SSS to SSSSSS. The empire itself throughout the ninth sector became known as AN, which means the highest or heaven, the Aryan Empire. 6. Interesting, then, how the Surian overlords later on started using Aryan, feminine names as names of their kings and royalty. The most prominent king of Sirius during the Sumerian times, and even long before and after, called himself An, adopted by the Sumerian languages, and he was Anu in Akkadian. 6. Peace in Orion. After perhaps millions of years of conquest, the Aryans eventually laid down their weapons. At least they did no longer offensively attack other star races, and now only used violence if they had to defend themselves against invader forces. And then only as the last result. The queen became tired of war and started realizing that killing is indeed a double-edged sword, where those who kill will later be killed in some revengeful situation, or maybe because if your energies are focused on war and killing, those are the energies you attract. And not only that. At some point, the queen and her people became much more spiritually oriented, perhaps thanks to her MAKH scientists, who may at one point have discovered that the universe indeed is feminine in nature. As the Aryan soul group evolved, they started seeing things differently, and they realized that they all were part of the Great Spirit, the creation of the Mother Goddess. And so, the religion of the Mother Goddess was eventually reaching a higher peak of development, where the queen, allegedly due to her basic fire, could connect with the KHAA and act as a medium for the goddess energy. People probably immediately let the word channeler come to mind, but it was apparently much more than that. The queen had a direct, telepathic connection with the goddess, and by many, both on the home planet and elsewhere in the empire and beyond, she became thought of as the goddess manifested. This, of course, couldn't have happened overnight, from her star race being ferocious conquerors to being accepted as the main spiritual group in this sector of the universe. It was a transition which probably took thousands, if not millions of years. Today, the Orion Queen is still the Queen of the Stars, but her empire is now a peaceful one, and star races from near and far come to Orion to trade or ask for advice. Star races, instead of being forced into the empire, are now asking for membership, or are asked to join if they see fit and ready. 7. The Aryan Founders, the Tree of Life and the Elixir of the Gods. The Aryans were, as we know, a highly technological society, and with time they became founders. They learned how to seed planets with life. Hence, instead of conquering other worlds, they now went out and did it the way that was expected from a higher evolved race. Although the universe was still relatively young, we are talking about billions of years ago, there were already lots of beings and star races who had evolved outside the Aryan Empire to become life designers at their own merit. However, there was an abundance of empty star systems which were ready to be panspermed. So the Orions lined up with creator gods from other star systems outside the Empire and even from other universes to seed new planets all around the Milky Way and beyond. Once these new planets had developed their fauna and flora, most of them were then being inhabited by their own intelligent race, who had the potentials to eventually reach the stars. Once these new races were ready, they either applied for membership in the Orion Empire, or were asked if they wanted to join. Most of them did, and do, while a few decided to go their own way, and some of these created their own empires eventually. There should be noted here that there is channel material, and the same thing can be read in Anton Park's work and others, where it is stated that the Orion Empire is known as a religious cult in the universe, where the Aryans worship a mother goddess, and the Orion Queen has put herself as the emissary of the goddess. This means that, if you subscribe to this cult, you can't pray or talk to the mother goddess without first going through the Queen. If this would be true, the Orion Empire is nothing but a religious dictatorship, similar to the Catholic Church on Earth, where the Pope has put himself between the people and the Creator, as the emissary to God. Although, I have reasons to believe that this is not the case, even if it may seem so to some readers. Again, I am trusting anonymous sources, whom I respect and have learned to trust. Still, I ask the readers to use their own judgment and discernment and do their own research where possible and doubt what I'm saying here if it doesn't ring true. I have no way at this time to prove my statements, other than presenting my experience and the knowledge I have gained. However, this is my knowledge, so each person needs to use their own intuition and imagination sometimes in order to connect the dots. The MAKH scientists, DEF, who were the Queen's personal scientists, were not only seeding planets and developing skills to create bodies from scratch, they also dedicated themselves to, among other things, finding a way to extend the life expectancy of a biological being. In the Bible this is referred to as the Tree of Life. It apparently took them 1,000,000 years, the way we count time, to develop an elixir which could extend life considerably. There were a few milestones on the way, where the scientists managed to extend the life cycle of an individual gradually, but no notable successes could be measured until after about 1,000,000 of years worth of research. Eventually, they could present the very life elixir which became the Tree of Life, and it became known as the SMA. The Queen and her race are cold-blooded because they are reptilians, but the MAKH scientists had found a way to develop extracts based on warm blood nutrients. 7. This liquid worked as an enhancer of the Queen's metabolism and added to a being's physical strength and vitality. It also had shown to extend the life of the Queen considerably, so basically, while looking for a way to extend the life of biological bodies, the solution came when looking into something totally different, a nutrient for the Queen. Amazingly enough, the SMA showed to extend the Queen's lifespan with up to perhaps millions of years, or more. Being part of the physical universe, or the 4%, everything ages and declines, even so the bodies of the Orion Queen. So in simple terms, what the MAKH scientists did was to take the KHAA essence and apply it to bodies in the physical universe. This liquid became known as Soma, from SMA, where S is causative, and Ma means mother in Aryan, the elixir of the gods or the fountain of youth. The Queen noticed that by taking this elixir, her aging halted considerably, and not only that, she stayed young, both at heart and in spirit. Figure 3-4. The Dalai Lama. So, the MAKH scientists continued their research along these lines and eventually found a way to reanimate a body. If a body died, and it was taken care of within a reasonable time afterwards, it could be reanimated and brought back to life. 8. This was only possible, of course, if the body was still in a reasonable shape. This is also why the Egyptian pharaohs were mummified. They thought they could be revived at a later time. In addition, they also learned how to regenerate bodies by taking cells from living beings and restore body parts in case of an injury or decay. Due to all this research, bodies could now be kept intact, almost forever, and death more or less became something that could be referred to in the history books. Before this elixir was totally developed, the Queen died of old age on occasion, and had to start anew in a new body, similar to how the Dalai Lama does it here on Earth, where the legend says that the Dalai Lama is reincarnating in a new body and just continues his mission. The new Dalai Lama has to be found, and there are certain body marks and other signs which tell the Lamas of the East how to find him. Once he's found, they teach him to remember who he really is, and he can re-establish himself as the new Dalai Lama. Transferred to our Orion story, the Queen would take a new body within the same bloodline as the old one and continue from there. This could at times be quite cumbersome, and with this new elixir, this problem became more or less obsolete. This liquid was also shared with other, trusted members of the Orion Empire and became the elixir of the gods that the Syrians and others fought over while here on Earth. We need to keep in mind, though, that the body of those star races are of a lighter density than those of humans, and thus live longer by default, and star beings in general, who are not trapped like we are, can normally, once they've reached a certain stage of development, choose whether they want to keep a purely physical body or not. Some think it's convenient, while others find it being an obstacle, so it varies. It is my understanding that the Orion Queen is indeed still keeping her body as a vessel to bring in the KHAA energies. Of course, over time the Aryan scientists learned how to clone whole bodies as well, and they were not the only ones who knew how to do that. It is, as we've discussed earlier, a common way for beings to jump from one body to the next, something the Syrians do all the time, and this technology is not isolated to the Aryan Empire. We can read extensively about it in Anton Park's chronicles as well as elsewhere in metaphysical literature. But due to the connection the Queen allegedly has established with the KHAA, one would presume she wants to keep her originally body as intact as possible and not degenerate it if she can avoid it. 8. The Syrian-Aryan War. Becoming a peaceful star race themselves didn't make all other star races in the galaxy peaceful, of course. This was something the Queen was soon to discover firsthand. There were always species attacking Orion from one flank or another in efforts to weaken the vast empire. This never worked, however. Orion was too strong. The Queen normally managed to calm the invaders down and either have them to leave, or started recruiting them for the Empire if they showed they could their ways. Some of them, when they saw the benefits, actually did, while others backed off. On rare occasion, Orion had to defend themselves, but the invaders soon realized that they didn't stand a chance. Dream of their surprise when all of a sudden a WOLFEN reptilian dwarf race hit their empire from southwest. Never before had the Tallarians seen anything like it. They, who called themselves the Syrian overlords, were the height of a human 10-year-old, but they were stocky, vicious-looking, fast and extremely strong. 9. They looked wolf-like, but with a reptilian horn bone across their foreheads. It was said that the more prominent a horn, the more powerful the being was. Many of them also wore helmets with horns on them. And the weirdest of it all, they came in hollowed-out planets. This way, they took the outer flanks of Orion with surprise and quickly came closer and closer to PESH-Me-10, the Queen's own Sector 9 star lane. 8.1 The first attacks on the Aryan Empire. Soon enough, however, when the Syrian overlords had fought a few battles, they realized that they had encountered what they thought was an equal enemy, and they finally got some resistance. The Walvan lords had learned how to navigate the nano-world with hollowed-out asteroids and planets, and these warships made an excellent shelter and a deadly weapon. An armada of hollowed-out planets could suddenly appear out of nowhere in space/time, taking everybody by surprise. Then they hit without mercy, making full use of their deadly weapons. The Syrians didn't hesitate. They attacked Orion with full force, despite the warnings from the Orion guards. The battles were furious and bloody. For the first time, the Syrians felt that they fought for their lives against an enemy that could meet their capacity. It didn't take them long, however, to realize that not only did the Orions meet their capacity, but by far exceeded it. They couldn't believe it. Someone could actually threaten the feared Canis lords. The Aryans' warning didn't go over well with the Syrians, so they had to taste the power of the Aryan Empire. The Aryans destroyed hollowed-out planet after planet, totally terminating all life and making it into stardust, floating around in space like grains of sand. Very few Syrians survived the Aryan counterattacks. The Syrians withdrew and licked their wounds. The King of Kings from Canis Major, the Lord Khanus, Death, was baffled and absolutely furious. He couldn't believe how easily his people were defeated. With his armor still on, he furiously sat himself down on his throne and breathed heavily through his teeth, making it sound like a tornado. He needed to change strategies, determined not to give up. Contrary to his method not to take any prisoners, but to kill all enemies and eat the wounded alive, he had decided to make an exception. He had ordered his men to take a few prisoners of war, whom he intended to interrogate and torture. But there was one thing that was even worse than being defeated, something he couldn't get over, and something that embarrassed him to the 10th degree. Many of the best of the Orion warriors were females. And the rulers of the Orion Empire were females as well. In his world, females were always in the background, standing behind the men, following every move they made. They were inferior and couldn't stand up to the males, and would not be allowed to. In Sirius and in Alpha Draconis, one of their most important colony, and on any conquered world, the male dominated the female. The Syrian people were sexual beings, and sex was basically what the male used the female for sex and as servants. The women on the Syrian worlds were breeding machines, and the males wanted strong offspring that could defend and strengthen their bloodline so that they got status and power over others. Don't mess with my family, or it was man eat man, or more accurately, wolf eat wolf, and the pure survival instinct. Sometimes, when the wars of conquest were raging on each flank, women could be called in for military service as well and went to war under the patriarchal regime. In his palace back in Sirius, the Khanus, the foremost king of kings, sat on his throne for hours and hours, too furious to do anything except delegating orders, deciding who was going to be punished and who was not. Finally, he stood up from his throne with a deadly and crazy look in his eyes. He called in his guards. "Take me to the dungeon. Show me the prisoners of war. Show me the trophies," he shouted. The guards immediately escorted the King of Kings to the palace dungeon. It was a very wet and cold place, lit up by a dim electronic light coming out directly from the stone walls. The palace was built on the top of a mountain, but the dungeon was underground and carved out directly from the hard mountain stone with the help of laser technology. It was a very depressing place and exclusively housed enemies of the state, where they sat waiting to be executed, a big event which usually drew thousands and thousands of people to watch, especially as the execution was going to be overseen by the King of Kings himself. Now, however, the dungeon was empty, except for these prisoners of war. He'd spared them because he needed to know more about this disgusting star race who dared to challenge the KHANUSKHANUR. On their way down to the dungeons, a royal interrogator had been picked up, carrying the key to the locker room where his torture arsenal was located, which was outside the thick, heavy door that led to the steps, which continued down to the dungeon cells. Just in case, the royal interrogator brought his most effective equipment down with him. The KHANUSKHANUR, his guards, and the interrogator eventually stopped outside a big dungeon and stared into the faded light inside. The king could see 3 prisoners in there, and they seemed to be in quite miserable shape. One of them seemed badly wounded, perhaps already died. The other one sat quietly staring into the wall, while the third, who was a female reptilian, met the king's eyes without blinking. The King of Kings found himself staring back into these black, ultra-deep eyes while a strange sensation came to his head. He felt like these non-blinking eyes took him right through the dimensions and into the great KHAA, the great void, which the king had traveled so many times, but always had respect for, and feared at the same time. So also now. It was something with these eyes and this look that scared the hell out of him. He, the great KHANUSKHANUR, was frightened. It made him furious again, too ashamed to admit his weakness in front of his people. All of a sudden his fear deepened and he found himself mesmerized by those space black eyes. He didn't know if it was in his imagination, but almost like a snake, the head of the female reptile started moving from left to right, right to left, and then in circles. The Syrian king noticed he lost control over both his body and his mind, and all he could do was to lean forward, towards the bars, slowly closing in on his strange prisoner. This all occurred in a few seconds' time, but it felt like he was in trance for an eternity. Then everything happened in the blink of an eye. One of the guards ran into the king and violently pushed him aside. This took him out of his trance in an instant and he grabbed for his evaporator, a gun-like weapon that could fry a diamond in a second. But the rest happened before the king even had the chance to interfere. Suddenly a hissing sound was heard, like a TT. The reptilian female spat like a cobra right in the face of the guard who had pushed the king out of target. The guard cried out in agony for half a second and fell dead or paralyzed to the floor. At the same time, a second guard had used his evaporator on the prisoner and killed her. The King of Kings was in shock and just stared with his eyes open at the dead black body on the floor, paying no attention to the guard beside him, who now certainly was dead. The remaining crew, happy to be alive, retreated quickly, out of target from the other 2 prisoners, and stared at each other. What the hell was that? The king cried out. The guard who had killed the female stepped forward, bowing deeply before his king before he spoke. I saw it, my King of Kings, I saw it, he said. This being seemed to hypnotize you and apparently, for some unknown reason, the guard saw what was to come, or he just reacted instinctively, because in the next moment this disgusting female spat venom right into his face. He went down instantly. And why was I never told that these creatures could hypnotize and spit poison? Shouted the king, now furious again. Someone must have noticed during the battles. In time, the King of Kings, much to his embarrassment, learned that not only was it the females alone who possessed this venom, but they had not even used it in battle, because they didn't find it necessary. The Syrians had been no match for the Aryan Air Force. But at this time, the king didn't know that. 8.2 The second attacks. The greatly wounded reptilian prisoner of war died under interrogation, so the only prisoner left from the first attack on the Aryan Empire was carefully tortured and interrogated. However, the Syrian king did not get much information from him either, except what the Aryan prisoner volunteered without torture. He said that the Aryan Empire is a peaceful empire and only goes to war if attacked. He added that the king should think carefully before he attacked again, because the queen could easily destroy the whole Syrian Empire. A much better option would be to sign a peace treaty with her and perhaps join the empire, abiding to its peaceful rules. The king just laughed at the suggestion, and when no one seemed to be able to get any more information out of the prisoner, he was left to the wolves, literally speaking. His body was eaten alive by a bloodthirsty audience. The next attack on the Aryan Empire was even more ferocious than the first. The wolf and reptilian overlords fought on pure adrenaline, determined to make as much damage as possible. The KHANUSKHANUR's hollowed-out planetoids showed up from nowhere in solar system after solar system belonging to the Aryans, thinking they could take the worlds by surprise and conquer them to make their own empire stronger. However, the Aryans always seemed to know where they were going to show up next and were waiting for them. The Syrians didn't stand a chance. Their asteroids and planetoids were shot to pieces by the Aryan mighty war machinery, and after yet another defeat, the King of Kings had to withdraw again. For the first time during his long regime, he felt weak and helpless. This was not good. A KHANUSKHANUR could never show weakness, or he'd be overthrown and killed, possibly by one of his own sons. So just to make sure, he sent his sons on missions far away from the Syrian throne, to solar systems many light years away, just to keep them busy enough not to attack him. He told his sons that they could descend to certain worlds and play around there as they pleased, something he knew they enjoyed. Playing around, however, was usually bad news for whomever lived on that planet. 8.3 The Peace Treaty. While the King of Kings was licking his wounds again, even more confused, furious, but also horrified for the first time in his life, the Orion Queen sat on her throne, pondering what was happening. Although it didn't seem like it to the Syrian king, the Syrians had made a great impact on NKHD death. They were still no match for the mighty empire of Orion. The MKH warriors had utterly defeated the Syrians in 2 major attacks and hugely decreased their warrior population. However, the queen knew that the Syrians almost certainly would try again, so what should she do? Destroy their entire civilization? That could be done, but nowadays, she preferred peaceful solutions when at all possible. She didn't see them as a threat, but she wanted them away from PESH-Me-10, knowing that whomever had control over the most commonly used passageway through the Milky Way galaxy also had control over much of the galaxy itself. She did not want the 9th passageway to fall into the hands of the Syrian lords. Figure 3-5. Orion's Belt, Alnitak, Alnilam, and Mintaka, headquarters of the Orion Empire. No, she had a better idea. First of all, she admired the skills and bravery of the Syrians. They were not as greatly trained as her own soldiers, but they were very strong, stubborn, and at least as ferocious as her own troops. It would be a pity to let this race be destroyed, so why not have them not only join her empire, but also be offered to work as advanced guards for her empire? So the Orion Queen invited the King of Kings of the mighty Syrian overlords to the Orion court in Mintaka for discussion, royalty to royalty. His own, and the safety of his guards, was guaranteed. The queen knew exactly how to talk the KHANUSKHANUR, the foremost king of kings, into this agreement. She told him how impressed she was by his war tactics and the bravery and strength of his warriors. His people were true KHAA warriors, she said, only comparable to the Aryans themselves. But she also showed them her own war machine in its fullest, without giving out any details of how it all worked. She didn't want them to be able to copy her weaponry. The Syrian king was very impressed and realized that the Aryans were way ahead of his own people, and that the Syrians could not match the military strength of the Orion queens. Then the queen started talking about the treaty. She suggested that the king and his men joined the Orion Empire in an alliance. If he and his people accepted, they would be given significant territories in the outskirts of Sector 9, get access to some major star routes, and the king's warriors would be granted the title, the queen's advanced guards. They would be her DAKH warriors. She also promised them free expansion of their own territories and continue doing as they pleased, so long as it did not get in the way of the Orion Empire itself, and they needed to stay away from PESH-Me-10. The Syrian Empire would also join forces with the Aryans, which would strengthen the Syrian status in the eyes of any future enemies. This last part was a compromise on the queen's part. She knew she couldn't stop the Syrians from having their ways when it came to conquering space, unless she wanted to terminate them. In exchange, the queen demanded obedience and loyalty to the throne of the queen. The Syrians would be obligated to execute her will, but on the other hand, the Syrian Empire would always have backup from Orion when needed, and they would fight side by side. Sirius and all its colonies would belong to the Orion Empire, but the Syrian kings were allowed to run their own empire as they wanted, if they followed the basic Aryans' laws and rules. Then they both sat silent for a while, and the queen noticed the hesitation in the king's eyes, but she also noticed that he could see the advantage of an alliance. After a few additional moments of silence, the queen gave the 2 punch lines. If the king accepted, she promised not to tell other star races how easily she defeated the Syrians, and she also promised not to terminate the Syrian Empire utterly and entirely with her superior weapons. The king's eyes froze. He knew that the queen was serious, and moreover, she was right. And last, but not the least, the queen suggested some goodwill marriages between Orion and Sirius. She said that this would hopefully bring the 2 species together and show both the Syrians and the Aryans that there now was a bond between them. The great divine marriage would stand between the queen and the king of kings himself, him that Sitchin and others call Anu. In addition, she offered one of her daughters to Anu's son of true Syrian blood. The daughter became known as Ninlil, and Anu's son was the infamous Enlil. Additionally, the queen wanted one daughter on each throne in the Syrian Empire, as each star system in the Syrian Empire had its own king. She wanted to make sure she had control over the situation and could get reports on what happened in every corner of the Syrian Empire at all times. The King of Kings would reign together with the Queen herself and would be allowed to become pretty independent so long as he followed the agreement and abided to Orion laws and policies. He and his people were also free to travel anywhere within the Orion Empire, and the Queen emphasized that all these marriages were just business deals, no more, no less. Her thoughts were that if she could keep an eye of the king, and her daughters could move to Sirius-occupied worlds and keep an eye on the ruling king and his often rebellious offspring and report back to her, she would have the situation pretty much under control. The kings and their royal offspring were also offered SMA to extend their longevity considerably. The queen's daughter would then become the queen of Sirius, and Anu's son would become the KHANUSKHANUR, thus keeping Anu's title once it was time for him to take over after the old king. As part of the deal, however, was that no descendant of the throne of the King of Kings could ascend to wear the title unless he was born from a royal daughter of Orion, and all priestess daughters had to be given full status as family members in the Syrian royal courts. 10. This was a guarantee for the queen that the kings would follow Orion policy and stick to the agreement, and for the kings it was a guarantee that no one could attack the Syrian Empire without getting assistance from Orion. She presented it as a win-win alliance, knowing that she would get the most ferocious and ruthless warriors in the galaxy as her advance guards. After all, it was purely a business deal. The king was flattered by her admiration for his empire, and also felt that there was soundness in the queen's appraisal, and he couldn't deny that life extension was quite a tempting offer. Anu finally spoke. He had, according to Syrian tradition, where men took as many wives they could handle, already a lot of women in his possession, and therefore had no moral problems going along with the plan. The queen had showed him earlier how the universe is feminine in nature, and that she, the queen, was like an extension of the goddess, and therefore the heir of the universe. This was what finally had the king of Sirius make his decision. He figured that if he married the queen, he would be the heir of the universe as well, and the lord of the Khaa, the void. And he had to admit that the Orion females were stunningly beautiful. He could never reach such high status on his own, and he knew it. He also liked the idea that his elite troops would be the advance guards in the court of the mother, and that he got quite an attractive sector of the Milky Way galaxy to oversee. The Syrian king sat back in his chair. He was pleased and thought he got the better deal. The queen smiled too, knowing he was wrong. 9. The Seven Sisters. When we hear the term Seven Sisters, we often think about the Pleiadian star cluster. In Greek mythology, the Seven Sisters were companions of Artemis, which already there connects them to Orion, see previous paper, the Orion Empire. They were, according to the same mythology, daughters of the Titan Atlas and the sea nymph Pleione, where sea often refers to the universe of the mother goddess, the 96%. The Seven Sisters in the Pleiadian star system are Maya, the eldest, Electra, Tegi, Alcyon, our central sun, Seleuno, Sterope, and Merope, who is the youngest, and wooed by Orion. She was said to become mortal and faded away. The constellation of Orion is still said to pursue the Seven Sisters across the night sky. The myth goes that it was Zeus, the ruler of the Greek gods, who immortalized the Seven Sisters and made them into a star cluster, which we still can enjoy today as the Pleiades in the night sky. Interestingly enough, according to Callimachus 11:12, the great Greek poet, critic, and scholar, the Seven Sisters were daughters of an Amazonian queen, and credited with inventing ritual dances and nighttime festivals. That would correspond pretty well with Aryan shamanism, as described in previous papers. Figure 3-6. The Seven Sisters doing a ritual dance, from an artist's view. In fact, the Seven Sisters were indeed the daughters of the Amazonian queen of Orion, and probably her firstborns. They were the ones who were appointed administrators of some of the conquered worlds in the Great Galactic Wars. Figure 3-7. The Seven Sisters star cluster in the Pleiades, the constellation of Taurus. The Pleiadian star cluster is in the constellation of Taurus, the bull. We discussed in an earlier paper how Orion with his club is chasing the bull, Taurus, but no such conflict is known in our mythology. However, we know from the Pleiadians, channeled by Barbara Marciniak, that the Pleiades have been rebellious on and off throughout cosmic history, and this may very well be why Orion is chasing her in an attempt to make her come to her senses. We know, from listening to the Pleiadians, that they are from our future, and are part of a living hell over in the Pleiades in the future time in which they are residing. This group of channels are supposedly a rebel group who is trying to steer things back to a more humane society in their own star systems. The Seven Sisters, and all other administrators of the different Aryan colonies, were headed by daughters of the Queen. In our folklore, we call them the Titans. They have also had a great impact on human history in ways unknown to most people. As usual, when there are big secrets, the Syrian overlords have more than one finger in it. 10. Peace in Orion again, sort of. With the peace treaty, the Orion Empire expanded again, both territorially and technologically. The Syrian lords had their own unique technology, which they now shared with the Aryans, and vice versa, so the two empires merged their knowledge for the benefit of both. Sirius still remained the headquarters of the Syrian Empire, and their colonies, such as that of Alpha Draconis, remain colonies of the Syrians. To get a picture of how this works, we may look at the Orion Empire as planet Earth with all its different countries. Now let's say there was a queen and a king ruling over all the countries in the world, a type of one-world government. Still, each country, star system, had its own rulers and was thus quite self-governed, although also answering to Orion's laws and regulations, business and trade etc., similar to the European Union. Sometimes each star system, country in our allegory, had their own colonies in other star systems as well, such as the Syrians having colonies in Alpha Draconis. So, when a star system joined the Orion Empire, they were still sovereign in most ways, except they had to follow the overall rules, quite like our own EU member countries. So the Syrian lords still minded their own business, but could anytime be summoned to the Mother's Court to serve as her advance guards, when needed. Peace now reigned again in the Orion Empire, kind of. The Syrians, who continued their conquest of space and expanded their own empire, were often at war with other star races, but the Aryans rarely participated, as there was no need. Also, at one point in time, an old, powerful enemy of the Aryan Empire became a problem again and a short war broke out. The Syrians immediately came to Aryan assistance and Orion and Sirius fought side by side for the first, and perhaps the last time. Their joined forces were undefeatable. The ferocious Aryan elite warriors and the Syrian overlords with their hollowed-out craft fighting together were overpowering for any enemy, and this previously so powerful enemy of Orion was quickly defeated and the survivors gave up and has not, to my knowledge, bothered Orion again. The Orion-Syrian peace treaty seemed to work pretty well for both parties, from their perspective. However, the Orion Queen would learn the hard way that the Syrian overlords were not, when it really came down to it, to be trusted. 11. Some thoughts and thoughts aside. When people think of the Great Galactic Wars, they think of this abundance of star races involved in it, fighting each other, not just the few I've brought up here. Indeed, I've only mentioned 2 races by name, the Aryans and the Syrians. There was more than that going on, much more. I described some of it in Level I, and the paper I wrote on it, Genesis paper number 1, Human Origins and the Living Library, is telling a little bit more about the Lyran Wars etc. But there was more than that, even, and the reason I am not bringing it up in details, neither in Level I and here in Level 2, is that these wars are not directly involving, or leading up to, our own history of Earth. Level 2 has as its purpose to narrow down and pinpoint what happened from the beginning of this universe and all the way up to present time, in something that could, for simplicity, be called a timeline which led directly to the creation of mankind and our development as a species. The rest I have either left out, or not researched well enough to present it. But I think that researchers and experiencers, such as Anton Parks, has much of it down quite right, although some of the characters and places are mixed up. This is not necessarily disinformation, but are probably serious attempts to get it right. It is not easy, because it's a jungle to go through before we have some information that holds water. Mr. Parks is definitely a must-read with all this in mind, because between the lines of what he writes you can sense the true story. The English translation, with long excerpts, making it consistent, and interviews with Parks can be found here, http://www.zyklon.net/enchantment/secrets.html. Many of the wars in the universe in the early days were the War of the Genders. This may seem odd to the reader, but this is a universal problem, which has led to much killing and suffering, and the Syrians have had a hand in almost all of them. Males have tried to find the secrets of the females, torture them, and use them in the most horrific rituals to steal their power. The females, on the other hand, have often refused to give it to them. They even created their own languages that could not be spoken by males. It was called Emesa 13, and was kept as a well-hidden secret between female priestesses, so they could communicate their secrets with each other. The males had their own language, which was called Emanita 14, but was spoken by females as well when they communicated with males. The females started the get back on the males, sometimes viciously, and wars broke out that terminated whole species to the last individual. There were times when the universe, at least in our sector, was not a very friendly place. Fortunately, this seems to have changed overall, although some wars are still raging out there. If the reader wants to know what's going on in the heavens, the easiest way to find out, without even having to do much research, is to see what is happening down here on Earth and translate it, as above, so below. Other than that, most wars have been about real estate. Each planet is looked at as real estate, and creator gods or conquerors who come there first own the star system. If they are ethical creator gods, they first ask for permission to create in a particular star system, but a star race on a conquest doesn't always bother, or doesn't yet know the universal laws, because they did things out of order. We are meant to become a peaceful, wise race before we start reaching for the stars, and learn how to create without harm to others, but not all species have the patience to wait that long, or their development as a star race is such that they become warrior-like spacefarers instead.